I'm Sarah Lynn Bowman, as we mentioned, and Electra Diakolambrianou will share with us in a bit. And we're going to talk about dual consciousness, what psychology and counseling theories can teach and learn regarding identity and the role-playing game experience. So our research questions are, how can existing psychological and counseling concepts help explain the phenomenon of role-playing games? And how are role-playing games similar or different from other psychological states? And how can these games give us insight into the nature of identity, which we define in various ways? And given these connections, how can they best be employed as a vehicle of personal and social change? So a little bit of role-playing game studies theory. We believe that role-playing games are a fundamentally psychological phenomenon, regardless of what area of study you come from. We all have brains and we're using them when we are role-playing, when we're imagining. So I won't go into a lot of the different states of immersion, but we're going to be fundamentally focusing on immersion into character here. And that is made happen by the magic circle of play, which is protected by alibi. And with this alibi, people have a dual consciousness in which they hold fiction and reality and player and character at the same time. This is a metacognitive state of consciousness, which helps them manage information between those states. So there's also the phenomenon of bleed, which can happen at the emotional, physical, ideological, or relational level. Bleed is when content spill in or out from the player to the character and vice versa. And these can lead to shifts in ego identity, relationship dynamics, and even experiences of marginalization. So a little bit about identity theory in role-playing game studies. Most definitions of identity describe a continuity of self, or what's called a sense of self, with this emphasis on the way we perceive ourselves, how we see ourselves and how others see us. We find comfort in having the sense that our identities are fixed, meaning they are consistent and unchanging. And from this perspective, it is understandable why any kinds of shifts in identity and role-playing games might feel a little destabilizing if they're really strong, especially when we consider the various types of bleed that we mentioned before. It also helps explain why some outsiders might find role-playing games so threatening because of these shifts in identity that occur. However, the vast majority of role players are able to engage in character enactment without any kind of major psychological or interpersonal disruption. And when a disruption does happen, it's usually related to psychosis of some sort, which is a very unusual state. So we won't be able to go into all the different types of characters, but I did do an ethnography in 2010 where I described 9 types of character. And these types are connected to how a player describes their own ego identity. Remember that continuous fixed state of self we just described versus the character. And so we talk about the doppelganger self, which is basically when somebody is playing themselves in a fictional environment. There's the augmented self when they have an extra aspect that's added to them. The devoid self when an aspect is taken away. The fragmented self when a part is blown up and made very manifest in the character. The repressed or regressive self when an inner child or an animalistic or pre-verbal state occurs. There's the idealized self, which is sort of the heroic self. Oppositional self, someone who's very different than us. The taboo self, when we're expressing or breaking social taboos through the character. And then the experimental self, when we're just seeing what might happen if, and playing a character based on that. So we're going to talk a little bit about immersion into character here. There's a spectrum of immersion. We pretend to believe that our identity is different. We adopt the worldview of the character through perspective taking, thinking, responding, and behaving according to this new identity. And that sometimes can allow us to have empathy for the character and also for people who might be in similar circumstances as the character. This is sometimes described as a driving metaphor, where the character is either the car itself and you're in the driver's seat, or in the passenger seat, or in the back seat, or the trunk. And that's when the character has fully taken over. Similarly, in a theatrical performance metaphor, the character, you are a marionette, sort of moving the character around. The character is a puppet, a mask, or a possessing force. But each of these theories presupposes identity as a fixed or stable state. Ego bleed, however, occurs, and that's when our personality and our archetypal content spill over from the character to the ego after the game. So not just a temporary emotional state, but actually contents of the personality of the character. And then there's also generalized identity bleed, which is when other forms of bleed affect the complex of our identity. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Electra, who's going to talk to us about some psychology and counseling theories.
Thank you, Sarah. And more specifically, we're going to talk about identity theories here. So starting from social psychology and social identity, here we see identity as a construct that is composed of the external labels that society applies in order to categorize people. This concept is based on symbolic interactionism, which means that all interactions are supposed to take place on a social stage within which people are expected to enact certain roles, certain normative roles. In this perspective, one's internal experience of identity is not considered valid unless society recognizes it. So there needs to be some identity verification from society. In this context, role-playing games can actually allow players to experiment with social roles and identities in ways that feel liberatory, especially for people who experience marginalization when it comes to their social identities in daily life. And we refer to that as emancipatory bleed. Next slide, please. Moving on to a more constructivist perspective, we're going to talk about narrative identity. So we construct narratives as part of a larger process of assimilating, accommodating, or even rejecting new information in order to be able to manage the cognitive overload and to make sense of our reality. In simpler words, we create narratives in order to make sense of our life and our world. Now, when these stories, when these narratives that we create, and specifically the dominant story, when it's problematic, it can become an obstacle to our personal growth and change, which in turn can be the cause of emotional pain, distress, and dysfunctionality. Dominant stories generally are combined into what some therapists call a person's narrative identity. And in narrative therapy, which is a specific approach in psychotherapy, the emphasis is helping the client create a redemptive story arc. So a story that will reframe the dominant story so far. Next slide, please. And connecting this back to role-playing games can create a bridge between a character's narrative identity and the player's personal narrative identity. And in this case, the gameplay can sometimes function as a kind of narrative psychotherapist. Now, a similar process can be also involved in certain cognitive behavioral therapy practices, where the emphasis is on altering the behavior associated with what a CBT therapist called the limiting belief, which is related to the dominant story from this perspective. Next slide. Back to you, Sarah, for this.
Thank you. So next, we're going to talk about identity as psychodynamic. In psychodynamic models of the mind, consciousness is divided into parts. Freud believed that the mind was created of three parts: the ego, the id, and the superego. And the ego is the conscious part of the self, whereas the id are these drives like aggression, erotic, and even suicidal drives. And then the superego is there to try to internalize social norms and impose them upon the id. And a lot of the experiences of frustration that we have or dysfunction come from repressing these forces within us. Jung expanded on this by talking about both the personal and the collective shadow, and also archetypes, so different aspects that are part of our unconscious and part of the collective unconscious that can be tapped into. And he was very interested in this process of individuation, where the confrontation with these symbols would basically cause the ego to evolve into another state of consciousness, but that this took some mental work to untangle. And D.W. Winnicott was also a psychodynamic theorist, and he was very interested in free play. He was very interested specifically in the way that we project our consciousness as a young child onto these transitional objects, meaning onto reality, whether it's a blanket or a stuffed animal or whatever. And this projection of fantasy on reality allows us to feel like we have some measure of control in a world that is constantly telling us that we really don't have much agency or control. And Winnicott was very concerned with the social dynamics in which people weren't allowed to play, because he found it was necessary for expressing what he thought to be a more authentic sense of self. And then there's Erik Erikson, who also advocated for pretend play. He believed that people project their personal themes onto the play table as little microcosms of what's going on in their consciousness. And he also was very interested in ego identity and this creation of, as we were talking about, a consistent sense of self. He thought that was really important to psychic development. So there's also shadow work, which has been discussed in connection with role-playing games, but both by Whitney Strix-Beltran and by myself. It often involves players exploring, experiencing loss, violation, and trauma, exerting power over others, portraying undesirable personality traits, expressing mental health challenges, and exploring dysfunctional or maladaptive social dynamics. So these are just a few ways in which people can engage in shadow work. There are some popular offshoots in therapy that involve playing of roles in some way in a psychodynamic manner. There's inner child and reparenting work. There's transactional analysis, in which there's a child state, an adult state, and a parent state that we switch between throughout the day. There's internal family systems, when there are lots of different parts within us that can be located and given expression. And then there's psychosynthesis, which is a similar kind of concept that works more with archetypes. And then there's dissociative identity work, where these parts are actually full personality constructs that often either are not aware of each other, meaning they're disassociated from one another, or they're in some sort of tension. And the idea is to bring them into harmony.
Yeah. Continuing with another perspective of identities. So unlike in the psychodynamic models, there are other approaches that see identity more holistically. And here we will focus more on the person-centered approach. So this approach views the person as an organism, which is seen as a holistic entity where biological, psychological, and social aspects of our existence are inseparable and intertwined. I won't go in detail into the whole theory because of lack of time, but I will shortly say that here the self is seen as a mosaic of configurations, so a range of differentiated self-concepts that appear in different circumstances. And identity is what is comprised from all of them. In addition to that, Virginia Axline later developed the child-centered play therapy model, in which she sees the combination of the play process with the therapeutic relationship as a vehicle of psychotherapeutic potential. And specifically, she has also drawn a set of principles and conditions through which this therapeutic relationship is built. Next slide. Okay, so what is the connection here with role-playing games? First one is that the configurations of self can help explain how easily we can shift from one character to the other. And also why we need alibi as a tool to access these parts of ourselves that may be suppressed through immersion into character, as we also talked about before. The second element is that many of Axeline's core principles can be very applicable to fostering safety between facilitators and players in role-playing games. And the third one is that exploring new, dormant, or even rejected configurations of self within a context that we feel safe in, as can be a role-playing game, it can help players access and practice a self that is more authentic. And this can be also very much connected to the types of characters that Sarah talked about before. Next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, we will go very shortly over some other psychotherapeutic applications of drama and role-playing. So in some cases, role-playing can be a standalone technique used within the context of a therapeutic modality. And a good example of this is Gestalt therapy, where there are some very famous techniques like the empty chair and top dog versus underdog. Then psychodrama, I think doesn't need an introduction. It has been established by Moreno, and it's an approach where the dramatic role is seen as an acting and interacting entity, very similarly to role-playing games. A lesser known approach is the fixed role therapy that has been constructed by Kelly in the 50s and 60s. It's a form of brief, constructivist and dramaturgical, as he calls it, therapy, where the therapist asks the client to enact a new role, written usually by the therapist for about 2 weeks, in order to explore in this way new ways of being and new identities. And lastly, drama therapy, which of course is an umbrella term under which we can find many different modalities. Generally though, there are 9 core processes coined by Phil Jones in the 90s that can be located in most role-playing games, and especially those that are designed and implemented for transformative purposes. Very shortly, these are dramatic projections, therapeutic performance process, drama therapeutic empathy and distancing, personification and impersonation, interactive audience and witnessing, embodiment, playing, life drama connection, and transformation. So to conclude, we tried to at least briefly explore the theoretical and practical intersections between role-playing game studies, psychology, and counseling and psychotherapy. And we think this illustrates the complexities involved in understanding consciousness and identity. And ultimately, while of course consciousness may be even impossible to fully articulate and understand, we believe that the meaning-making process involved in exploring identity on and off game is something valuable in itself. Here you can see some of our main references. The full references are of course in the article. Thank you very much, and this is how you can contact us.